He was supposed to marry someone else that weekend. He knew it. She knew it. And still, when he called her name across that snow-covered mountain, she turned around. Because some mistakes don't feel like mistakes until long after the damage is done. And some silences carry more truth than any promise ever could. The first time Thandej saw Yoon Seok-jin, she wasn't looking for anything. She had come to Seoul for work, a 3-month contract with an architecture firm in Gangnam, a quiet opportunity to expand her portfolio and breathe somewhere new. She had brought 2 suitcases, a small notebook full of sketches, and absolutely no intention of complicating her life. She was not the kind of woman who looked for trouble. Trouble, apparently, had other plans. It was a Tuesday evening in October when she walked into the wrong restaurant. She'd been given an address by a colleague, a dinner reservation at a small Korean fusion place near the Han River. She'd written it down wrong, or the GPS had failed her, or perhaps the universe had simply decided to be unkind in the most beautiful way possible. Whatever the reason, she pushed open the heavy glass door of a private dining establishment she had no business entering and immediately knew she was somewhere she did not belong. The room was low-lit, dark wood, black marble, white orchids on every table. A place designed for people who spoke in whispers and never said what they truly meant. The kind of place where a meal cost more than her weekly salary back in Lagos. A man in a charcoal suit looked up from across the room. He was sitting alone at the far end of the dining area, a glass of wine untouched at his right hand, documents spread before him that he'd clearly been staring at without reading. He had the kind of face that stopped you mid-thought, not because it was particularly soft or warm, but because it held something that most faces didn't. Weight, accumulated and unspoken. He looked at her. She looked at him. A staff member appeared at her elbow immediately, polite but firm. "Excuse me, miss, this is a private reservation, I know," she said, already backing toward the door. "I'm sorry, wrong address." She turned to leave. "Wait," the voice was quiet. Not a command, something gentler than that. Something almost uncertain, which surprised her more than anything else about that moment. She turned back. Yoon Seok-jin had not moved from his seat. He was watching her the way people watch something they're trying to memorize before it disappears. "Have you eaten?" he asked. It was a strange question from a stranger in a restaurant she wasn't supposed to be in. She should have said no and left. Every reasonable instinct in her body told her to leave. "No," she said. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. She should have said no to that too. She sat down. They talked for 2 hours. Not about important things at first, about Seoul in autumn, about the smell of the Han River at night, about how different cities carry different kinds of silence. He asked about her work and actually listened to her answer, which was rarer than it should have been. She asked him what he did, and he paused just briefly before saying business in the vague, careful way of a man who had learned that honesty in certain places was a luxury he couldn't afford. She noticed the pause. She filed it away somewhere quiet inside herself and kept talking. What she didn't know, what she would only understand much later, when understanding it no longer changed anything, was who Yoon Seok-jin really was. In Seoul's underworld, his name was spoken with a particular kind of deference, not loud, never loud. The men who dealt in violence and fear learned quickly that the ones to truly worrying about were the ones who never raised their voices. Yoon Seok-jin ran one of the most powerful criminal networks in the city, an organization that had embedded itself so deeply into legitimate business that the two had become almost indistinguishable. He had started young, inherited less than he built, and paid for his power in ways that had permanently altered something behind his eyes. He was also engaged. Her name was Park Ji-yeon, the daughter of a business associate, a union arranged with the quiet efficiency of two families who understood that love was secondary to structure. The wedding was scheduled for December. Invitations had been sent. A venue had been booked. Everything was in order. Everything was in order. And Yoon Seok-jin had been sitting alone in a private restaurant on a Tuesday evening, staring at documents he wasn't reading, because somewhere beneath the discipline and the distance and the carefully maintained control, he was deeply, quietly unhappy. Thandit didn't know any of this when she laughed at something he said about misreading a menu his first time in a foreign country. She didn't know it when she told him about her grandmother in Soweto, who used to say that buildings were just prayers made out of stone. She didn't know it when he grew still and repeated those words softly, like they meant something to him that he couldn't fully name. She just knew that it was nearly midnight when she finally looked at her watch, and that the evening had passed the way good things do too fast, and leaving too much behind. "I should go," she said. He walked her to the door himself, sent the staff away with a look, stood with her for a moment at the threshold while the city hummed around them in the dark. "I don't know your name," he said, Thandit. She told him. He said it once, quietly, like he was learning the shape of it. "Yoon Seok-jin," he offered. She nodded. She stepped out into the night. She walked 2 blocks before she realized she was smiling, and the smile felt like the beginning of something she wasn't prepared for. She told herself it was just one evening, one wrong turn, one right conversation. The kind of thing you remember for a few days and then let go of. But 3 days later, her phone lit up with an unknown Seoul number. And she knew even before she answered that she was already in trouble. He called twice before she picked up, not because she didn't want to answer. Because she stood there in her small rented apartment in Mapo, watching her phone vibrate against the kitchen counter, and understood with perfect clarity that answering it would mean something. That it would be a choice, not an accident. The 3rd call, she answered. "I want to show you something," Seok-jin said. "Not dinner, not conversation. Just come." "That's not enough information," Thandit said. A pause, then quietly, "I know." She went. He took her to a rooftop in Bukhan, an old Hanok building that had been partially renovated, sitting above the tiled rooftops of the village like something preserved on purpose, spared from the city's relentless forward motion. He had a key. Of course, he had a key. She was beginning to understand that Yoon Seok-jin had access to many things that most people didn't, and that she perhaps should ask more questions about why. But standing up there in the cold October air, with Seoul spread out beneath them in every direction like a map of light and shadow, the questions got quiet. "I come here when I need to remember what things looked like before they got complicated," he said. She looked at him instead of the city. "What complicated them?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. He had a habit of that, of holding silence like it was something tangible, something he was deciding whether to hand over. She found she didn't push. There was something about the way he carried his quiet that made her want to wait for it, rather than fill it up. "Everything," he finally said, "the wrong choices that looked like the right ones at the time. The things I inherited, the things I chose anyway." She turned back to the skyline. "I know something about that," she said. He looked at her then. "You don't seem like someone who makes wrong choices." "Everyone does," she said. "Mine just tend to be quieter." Something shifted in his expression, subtle, almost imperceptible. Like a door opening only a centimeter, enough to sense the room behind it without stepping through. They stayed there for a long time, talking, not talking. Leaning into the kind of company that doesn't demand anything. And somewhere in that space, somewhere between the cold air and the city lights and the unasked questions, the distance between them began to close. She knew about the engagement 2 weeks later, not from him. From a colleague who recognized his name when she mentioned having dinner in his neighborhood. The colleague had grown wide-eyed and pulled out her phone and shown her a Society page article. Yoon Seok-jin and Park Ji-yeon, set to Wednesday, December 14th at the Grand Hyatt Seoul. Thandit read it once. Set the phone down, sat very still. She didn't cry. She wasn't the kind of woman who cried quickly or easily. She had learned in her life to feel things in layers, to let the surface settle before she went looking at what was underneath. What was underneath, when she finally looked, was hurt, clean and simple. Not because he had deceived her. Technically, he hadn't. Nothing had been declared. No promises had been made. They had shared evenings and rooftops and conversations that felt like more than they were supposed to. That was all, but it had felt like more than that. And that was the thing she couldn't easily put down. She told herself she was going to create distance. She told herself this on a Monday. By Friday, she was sitting across from him in a cafe in Hongdae, having accepted his invitation without fully understanding why. He looked at her face when she sat down and knew immediately that something had changed. "You know," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. The silence between them took on a different texture then, heavier. "Honest, I should have told you," he said. "Yes," she said again. "You should have." He didn't try to explain it away or dress it in better language. He just said, "I'm sorry." And the way he said it, quietly, without performance, made it worse somehow, because it was clearly true. She looked at her hands, then at him. "Is it what you want?" She asked. "The wedding." The pause that followed was the longest she had ever watched him hold. "No," he said. Just that. Just no, spoken so simply that it landed like a stone dropped into still water. She should have left then. She knew it. She could feel the weight of every reasonable instinct she had pressing her toward the door. She was not a woman who made herself secondary to someone else's life. She was not a woman who stayed where she didn't belong. But she looked at him, at the tiredness behind his eyes, at the way he held himself like a man carrying something no one had ever offered to help him set down, and the reasonable instincts went quiet. It was late November when the ski trip was proposed. Not by her, by him. And not framed as escape, framed as something else, something almost practical. He had a property in Gangwon-do near the Yangpyeong resort. He went every year. This year, he said, he didn't want to go alone. What he didn't tell her, what she would only find out later, was that the ski trip fell over the weekend of a pre-wedding celebration that his fiancé's family had planned. That Park Ji-yeon would be waiting. That phone calls would go unanswered. That by the time the weekend was over, the silence from his end would be understood by everyone in that world as a statement. He chose to go. He chose her. And Thandib, standing at the resort with snow falling around her shoulders and his hand warm at the small of her back, felt for the first time in her adult life that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She didn't know yet what that choice had cost. She didn't know yet what it would cost her in return. The night of the snowfall was quiet in the way that only mountain nights can be insulated, complete. Like the world had decided to hold its breath. They had been careful until that night. Careful in the way of to people who understood the weight of what they were walking toward and had been slowing themselves deliberately, as if slowness could change the destination. It couldn't. What passed between them that night was not reckless. That was the thing she would think about later. It never felt reckless. It felt inevitable in the way that certain things do. Like a word you've been holding in your chest for months, and when it finally comes out, it doesn't feel like a beginning or an ending. It feels like the truth. She woke up before him. Snow light through the window, his breathing slow and even beside her. His hands still loosely around hers. And for one long, perfect moment, she let herself have it. She let herself believe it could stay this simple. She didn't know that in 12 days, everything she thought she understood about her own body would change. And that the truth she'd felt in that mountain room would become the most complicated thing she had ever carried. She almost didn't take the test. She told herself she was tired from travel. That her body was adjusting to the cold, to the altitude, to the disorientation of being in a country that was never supposed to feel like home but was beginning to. She told herself she was overthinking, which was something she had always been too good at. She bought the test on a Wednesday afternoon from a pharmacy in Mapo, tucked it into the bottom of her bag, and carried it home without looking at it for 2 days. The result appeared in the small window the way all life-altering truths do, quietly, without drama, without any acknowledgement of what it was about to change. Thandip sat on the cold tile floor of her bathroom and looked at it for a very long time. She didn't cry. Not then. She just sat there while the city went on outside her window. The sounds of evening traffic, the distant melody of a street vendor, still moving through its ordinary rhythms, and felt the full weight of what was inside that small window. A baby. His baby. She pressed her hand flat against the tile floor. She breathed. She counted her breaths the way her grandmother had taught her when she was very small and the world felt too large. 1, 2, 3, by 10, she had stopped shaking. By 20, she had begun to think. In the weeks that followed the ski trip, things had shifted. Seok-jin had returned to Seoul, to his life, to the responsibilities and structures that did not bend around feelings. The pre-wedding weekend he had missed had caused damage that was being managed in the careful, cold way that damage in his world was always managed. Phone calls had been made. Faces had been smoothed back into appropriate expressions. The wedding was still on. She knew all of this because he had told her, with the same quiet honesty that had characterized everything between them, sitting in her apartment one evening, his coat still on, like he didn't trust himself to stay if he took it off. "I can't walk away from this," he had said. "Not yet. There are things, obligations I inherited long before I understood what I was agreeing to. People who would be put at risk." She had listened without interrupting. "I know that's not enough," he'd said. "I know what I'm asking." "You're not asking me anything," she'd said quietly. "You're telling me." He'd flinched, very slightly. Good, he should have. "Thandip, I understand," she'd said. And the hardest part was that she had. She understood the machinery of his life even without knowing all of its details. She could see it in the way he moved through space, always slightly watchful, always accounting for exits and angles. She understood that he lived inside something that had walls she could not see. Understanding didn't make it easier. It just made it quieter. Now, sitting on the bathroom floor with a positive test in her hand, she turned over everything she knew. She thought about Yoon Seok-jin, the real one. Not the man from the restaurant, or the rooftop, or the snow. The man she had slowly begun to understand lived beneath all of that. She had done research, once the feeling in her chest had gotten too specific to ignore. She'd been careful about it, not confrontational, not accusatory, just informed. What she found confirmed what she'd suspected and filled in details that made her stomach tight. He ran an organization that dealt in violence, that used people, that operated in spaces where the law was a suggestion and loyalty was enforced through fear. He had never aimed any of that at her. He had been, with her, something else entirely, something that seemed to cost him effort, like a man pressing his hands against a wound he didn't usually let himself tend. But the wound existed. And the world around it existed. And now there was a baby, his baby. A child who would be born into a bloodline that powerful, dangerous men already had opinions about. A child who could be used, who could be threatened, who could be taken or hidden or leveraged in the way that everything in that world eventually was. She thought about this for a long time. She was not a woman given to panic. She had grown up watching her mother make impossible decisions with steady hands, had watched her grandmother bury grief and build something forward-facing from the rubble of it. She came from women who did not collapse. But she also came from women who were honest with themselves about what they were facing. And what she was facing was this: she was pregnant, alone in a foreign country, by a man who was about to marry someone else and who ran something she wanted no part of for her child. She had a 3-month contract that was ending in 4 weeks. She had a family in South Africa. She had a way out. The decision didn't come all at once. It built slowly, Over 7 days, the way necessary things often do, accumulating certainty in small, painful increments until the weight of it could no longer be denied. She would go home. She would not tell him. Not yet, maybe not ever, she thought, though the thought made something in her chest pull in a direction she didn't want to examine. She booked her flight on a Thursday evening, hands steady, heart not. She allowed herself one last thing. She went to the rooftop in Buchan. She didn't tell him. He had no idea she was leaving, or why, or what she was carrying. She simply went, alone, in the gray afternoon light, and stood where they had stood together and looked at the city. Seoul was beautiful, in a complicated way, the way all beautiful things are when you've loved something inside them that you can't keep. She pressed her hand to her stomach. "I'm going to keep you safe," she told the small, impossible fact of her child. "That's the only thing I know how to promise right now." But I promise that. The wind moved through the Hanak tiles below her. She stood there until the cold became too much. Then she turned around and walked back into her life without him. She left on a Saturday morning in December, the day his wedding rehearsal was scheduled. She didn't know that when she booked the ticket, or maybe some quiet, self-protective part of her had known and had chosen it deliberately, a clean line drawn in both their timelines at exactly the same moment. She checked her apartment one last time, left her keys with the building manager, wheeled her two suitcases to the elevator. In the taxi to Incheon, Seoul moved past her window in the early morning light, the Han River, the bridges, the towers, the quiet residential streets she had walked so many times in the last 3 months. She watched all of it like a woman memorizing something she will never see again. She thought of him once, just once. She allowed it, and then she let it go, the way you let go of things you can't carry and can't afford to put down slowly. The airport was loud and bright and full of people going everywhere. Thandi found her gate. She sat down. She did not cry. Home, she thought. I'm going home. The baby was a secret she wore like a second heartbeat, present, persistent, already becoming the most important thing about her. What she didn't know, as the plane lifted off the runway and Seoul fell away beneath the clouds, was that Yoon Seok-jin was not at his rehearsal. He had called her number 40 minutes earlier, standing outside a hotel in Gangnam in the gray December morning. Having made the second most consequential decision of his adult life, the call went straight to voicemail. And the look on his face when it did, the specific, private devastation of a man who has arrived too late, was the kind of look no one else in the world would ever know he wore. Because by the time the call connected to her recorded voice, Thandi was already gone. And she was carrying the one secret that would make the silence between them impossible to keep forever. 3 years passed the way grief does, not all at once, but in layers. Thandi built her life in Johannesburg with the same quiet determination she brought to everything, a small architecture practice, a modest house in Mabening with a garden her daughter loved, a routine that held. Her daughter's name was Seoyuna. She hadn't planned to give her a Korean name. It arrived one night, 3 weeks after the birth, when Thandi was sitting in the dark holding this small, sleeping person who had her own eyes and his jaw and an expression of absolute seriousness that belonged to no one else in the world. "Seoyuna," she'd whispered, "so you remember where you come from?" She never spoke about the father. Her mother asked once, her friends stopped asking. Only her grandmother, 81 years old, sharp as a blade, ever looked at Seoyuna's face and then at Thandi's and said, with the particular gentleness of a woman who has buried many things, "Whenever you're ready." Thandi's was not ready. She told herself she was protecting her daughter. She told herself the distance was necessary, that the world Seok-jin moved in had no place for a child's safety. She told herself these things every morning, and most mornings she believed them. Some nights were harder than others. She was reviewing blueprints on a Tuesday afternoon when her phone lit up, an unknown Korean number. Her hands went still. After 3 years of silence, 3 years she had built herself around, the number sat on her screen like a question she had never stopped waiting to answer. She let it ring. He had found her the same way she had feared he would, through time and resources, and a particular kind of stubborn refusal to accept absence as a final answer. Seo-jin arrived in Johannesburg on a Thursday with no announcement. He had not called ahead. He stood at the edge of her street in the warm southern hemisphere light, looking like a man who had rehearsed nothing, which, for someone who controlled everything, was the most frightening thing about him. Thandit opened the door before he could knock. She had known, somehow. The way you know when something you've been bracing for has finally arrived. They looked at each other across the threshold. 3 years in that look, every unsaid word. Every morning she'd pressed her daughter's face to hers and felt the complicated love of raising someone who belonged to a man she'd never stopped thinking about. "You should have told me," he said, not angry, something past anger. Something exhausted and true. "I know," she said. It was the same exchange they'd had once before, in a cafe in Hongdae. Different words, identical weight. "She has my eyes," he said quietly. He had seen Seo-yuna through the garden window. Thandit hadn't shielded that from him. It had felt, suddenly, like too cruel a thing to do. "Yes," Thandit said, "she does." The silence between them was enormous and familiar all at once. "I left it," he said, before she could close the door on whatever this was. She looked at him, the organization, everything. His voice was quiet and completely steady. "It took 2 years, but I left it." Thandit felt something shift in her chest, old and stubborn and reluctant. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "Because I wanted to be someone she could know," he said. He didn't ask to come inside immediately. He waited. He had learned, apparently, how to wait. Over the following weeks, it was Seo-yuna who dismantled the distance faster than either of her parents could manage. Children have no patience for the complicated architecture of adult pain. She accepted him with the disarming simplicity of a 3-year-old who saw a person, not a history. He read to her. He learned which vegetables she refused and which she accepted if they were cut a certain way. He sat on the garden floor and let her explain things to him with great seriousness. And he listened the way Thandit had once noticed he listened, completely, like nothing else existed. Watching him, she felt the last layer of the wall she'd built begin to give, not collapse. Give slowly, honestly, the way things loosen when they've been held too long. "I'm not the same person," he said to her one evening, after Seo-yuna was asleep. "I know," she said. "Neither am I. Is there still something here?" he asked, honestly. She was quiet for a long time. She thought about the rooftop in Buchan. The snow, the bathroom floor, the flight. 3 years of building a life that was full and real and entirely without him, and still, somehow, incomplete in the specific shape of him. "Yes," she said finally, "there is still something here." It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something more honest than that, to people choosing, carefully and with full knowledge of the cost, to try. Outside, Johannesburg breathed in the night. Seo-yuna slept with her father's jaw and her mother's eyes and all the complicated grace of a child who had never once doubted she was loved. Some things survive the silence. Some loves don't die, they just wait, patient as stone, for the people inside them to find their way back. Thandit leaned her head against his shoulder. He didn't move, he just stayed. For now, that was enough. She didn't wait for him to save her. She saved herself first. And then, when he had done the same, there was finally something worth returning to.